Hello and welcome to Farmgate. I'm Costain, the editor of 8.9.com. One of the primary characters linked to the average farm is the farm vet. But while many farms are still stuck on an annual treadmill of births, deaths, vaccinations and wormers, there are an increasing number who are rarely seeing their vet at all. But how do farmers reach that level of resilience? Well, the role of the farm vet is critical in navigating the transition to food and ecological security. And today I'm going to find out what that means in practice. How is the veterinary profession changing? Can a business model built on meds and emergency care pivot to preventative health and farm system advice? So in this programme, I'm joined by the regenerative vet, Claire Whittle, by Leanne Oliver from Ruminant Revival, and by Helen Rogers, a regenerative farmer and a director of Friars Moor Livestock Health. Claire, you've called yourself the regenerative vet. What does that mean?
Hopefully exactly what it says on the tin, ffinlo. I guess for me, regenerative farming means sort of farming as close to nature as possible. So I want for me and other farmers to have healthy animals that form sort of part of a healthy ecosystem. And I guess by an ecosystem, what I would mean is that farm being made up of all of the sort of biological organisms that are there. So from the farmer, who's obviously very, very important in that situation, to the soil, the wildlife, the trees, and then how they sort of interact with that physical environment. So for me, I think sort of reducing the need for external inputs, whether that's feed or veterinary bills or any other sort of pharmaceutical inputs, for example, that sort of improves the resilience of those farms and hopefully their bottom line as well.
Fantastic. So, Leanne, you're working in a similar way to Claire, I think, but you're sort of worried that the word regenerative can scare some farmers away, that it's preaching to the converted, providing services for the converted, I suppose. So why do you think that? And what are the outcomes that you're working to achieve on the farms that you're working with?
Yeah, I think the term regenerative to some of the farmers that haven't engaged with that terminology from an early stage, it's maybe misconstrued a little bit and being seen as environmentalist or eco warriors. And there's some farmers I feel are quite averse to being labelled as such, although many farmers will be adopting principles of regenerative agriculture, and they will be improving their soil health, and as a result they'll be more profitable and have better animal health welfare outcomes, but they probably don't see themselves as labelled as regenerative farmers, and that's okay. And I think that's the beauty of regenerative agriculture, that you're not all in or all out. As long as you understand what you're doing and what actions you're undertaking on your farm maybe have positive or negative effects, you can work towards an outcome, but we're doing that by making informed decisions.
So what sort of words are you tending to use instead of regenerative?
I would probably use soil health and ecosystems rather than necessarily using the word regen or regenerative. Just to, I don't know. I mean, this has been debated wildly, and during your podcast as well. How do you define it? You know, it means something different to different people. And I think Claire's just given you a lovely description about breaking it down, actually what it means. And until we get that word out there in the mainstream a bit more broadly, it maybe is going to have some negative connotations to different people.
So bearing in mind what Leanne said there, Claire, are you worried that, using the word regenerative, that you were sort of almost limiting the market that you're available to?
But yes, potentially, and I have queried the name several times. I suppose we launched quite a long time ago now, about 3 years ago, where that word was. Yeah, I suppose I could have called myself the agro-ecological vet. The word holistic vet was already taken. I don't mind being labelled as an eco-warrior or an environmentalist, because I think I would probably class myself as both of those things. And it also means I get to kind of pick the farmers that I want to work with, who are coming to me with those ideas in mind. But yeah, Leanne's exactly right. And you just given her a really awkward question there, ffinlo, based on my business name. I thought I like that. But yeah, no, I would say it doesn't. I don't think it's had any effect necessarily. But the soil health point is obviously the most important bit, and however people are getting to that. And I think what Leanne said as well, there's different sort of people on that spectrum. I think one of the things, the groundswell definition of regen is that it's a journey, not a destination. So it's wherever you are on that journey, happy to engage in that. And it's great that there's vets really involved in it as well.
Well, I'm not sure if this, as a follow-up, is going to be more difficult or less difficult, but you mentioned that the word regenerative, it was 3 years or so ago that you chose the name. And certainly, regen at that time, it was much more of a new idea. There was no backlash to it at that point. Have you recognized that there is some kind of a backlash? And do you have any sense of why that backlash has occurred?
I think people are generally a bit concerned about not being, it's like not the status quo. And like, I think there's this sort of there feels like there's sometimes a hard line between what you would call conventional farming. And I think that can actually sound quite derogatory in a sense. And regenerative sounds like you're sort of heading up towards the next level of something. And that's not a great place to sort of be in. And I feel like there's people who are very much on the fence on both, not on the fence, sorry, very much hard lined on both sides that disagree somewhere in the middle. Whereas actually, like I say, if we start thinking about it as a journey and a movement towards from the soil health principles and sort of nature-based recovery and that kind of thing, it's a very different world. And I think a lot of farmers have so much more in common than they do apart. So yeah, so I do think it's tricky for people to engage with the other side when they're very much in a no. And I'm guilty myself of getting caught in an echo chamber as well. You can start hearing things and you believe that, and you can find things that suit your own opinions. I think social media has a role to play in that as well. So yeah, I think we just need to be careful and be very open to all different kinds of farming, because I think that diversity is probably key.
And back to you, Leanne, on that, because clearly, you've chosen your name a couple of years after Claire, I suppose. And so you must be aware of that backlash. How is it manifesting, in the farmer community around you?
Yeah, I suppose we chose the name Ruminant Revival because it was very much focused on integrating livestock into farming systems and making a point that that is a huge part of where we need to go in terms of soil health and climate change and the biodiversity that we're trying to create. And I suppose we're not maybe quite we will work with farmers that aren't regenerative farmers. So our spec is a little bit broader potentially. So our big focus is removing inputs from systems, and a lot of that advice is focused on soil health because the two run side by side, especially when you're talking your beef suckler and sheep systems. But we would work with calf health and colostrum management and all that kind of stuff, which maybe wouldn't be classed as regenerative. So I suppose our business focus is a little bit broader in terms of being more preventative and reducing the reliance on inputs by changing systems in terms of nutrition management and genetics.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. And just before we go across to Helen, and without getting the sense that the veterinary profession is in any way incestuous, I believe you cut your teeth early with Friars Moor, where Helen works.
Helen's like laughing at this. Yeah. My first 2 years, so out of vet school, were at Friars Moor, which was one of my favourite 2 years of vetting of my entire life. I think in my first year, I won the golden syringe, which was the
golden syringe. What's that?
It was the award for like the most stupid thing on farm. And I think I'd replaced a prolapse with another vet. So Yoav is another one of the vets there. And I put this prolapse back in. And often when you do that, so you put the whole uterus, which is massive outside of a cow, back in through a very small opening. And you often release a pressure on their urethra, which means they urinate. And I had the on-call phone in my pocket at the time. And I got up and I washed off at the end. And it was one of those like old Nokias. And I think I thought I could save the phone by sucking the water out of it. And it wasn't full of water. It was absolutely full of urine. So despite the fact I'd stood by the vet code of keep your mouth shut, which is usually a very good thing to do when you're at the back end of a cow, it wasn't a pleasant experience.
Yeah. Helen, do you remember those days?
I do. They were very fun days.
Brilliant.
There are a lot of stories that we could tell.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll come back and just do a podcast of stories in the future. But Friars Moor has been trying to adjust its model from emergency care to preventative health management for livestock for several years now. Why have you been trying to do that? Why is that important?
I think we recognised a long time ago that in order to contribute to both our farms and society, I guess, as a whole, we needed to create and help create really resilient, successful farms. And to do that, we needed to move away from that historical model of providing emergency care to really contributing to the whole ecosystem on the farm and facilitating change on the farm as a whole. So ultimately, that allows us to continue to have a successful business, and it means that we have farmers who are motivated and positive and moving forward, which is really motivating for us in itself.
And as you've gone through that transition, have you found that the farmers around you have been quite happy to follow that?
It's always been in their best interest, and the industry has moved forward too. So ultimately, it's all about the healthier our animals are, the less money and the less inputs that they'll need, like Leanne said. So ultimately, that's going to be beneficial to the farm and the farm profit at the end of the day. So yeah, they've been, as long as we can demonstrate that change will make improvements, then yeah, they've been really keen to move with us.
And how have you engaged with that conversation? How have you achieved the shift from essentially the NHS model to something which is much more, about preventative healthcare, healthcare planning, that sort of thing? What are those sort of key elements?
So a lot of it comes down to the quirkiness of all of our farmers that we deal with, which is one of the best things about our job. So I think understanding like the motivation behind our farmers and their characters is really important. So we act essentially as a facilitator. But then also, we've come back to looking at benchmarking of data, going back to genetics, nutritional advice, all of those things that really, so you have to identify what actually motivates the farmer and what's going to create change. And so a lot of that has started from looking at data, working out how to have conversations with the farmers, and then how to initiate change after that.
And when you talk about data, those sort of the benchmarking that you're talking about, what are the sort of things that you're benchmarking?
And so it depends on the system, but you kind of need to strip it down to relatively simple things to start off with. So if you had beef or sheep farms, you could look at the kind of total weight of product sold at the end, whether that be lamb or beef, relative to the number of cows or sheep that are put to the ram or the bull. So that's essentially looking at efficiency. And we can do the same. And in the dairy industry, there's oodles of data that we can look at. But most of it needs to focus on efficiency and where there are losses and how you can make that farm more resilient off the back of it.
And when you talk about benchmarking, is that benchmarking within the farmer group, within the Friars Moor sort of client base, or are you sort of benchmarking more broadly across the country?
So it tends to be within the farmer client base because farmers are really good at taking loads away from farmer meetings when they talk to other farmers. So they might not take very much away from you, but they'll take a lot away from their neighbours. So benchmarking within our client database is really how we've started doing that. And that always started anonymously. And then as the groups that we share that data with have become more familiar and more confident, we then lose that anonymity and we share really openly how people have made changes and what they think has been successful or what hasn't worked.
And when we're thinking about that sort of benchmarking approach, I guess, an old-fashioned way of looking at it would be that it's just it's looking over the hedge, but you're looking over the hedge at a lot more farms and doing it more efficiently and more, effectively. The information is quite precise.
Everyone loves looking over the hedge. We're all innately nosy, aren't we? And you can do that on a tractor really effectively. So yeah, it's a really nice motivator, I think, for farmers to see how other people in the area are getting on.
Yeah, and what are things that I'm sort of aware of, perhaps because of the work that that I was doing at Farmwell before even Farmgate started, let alone 8.9, was the work that we were doing with government in the post-Brexit period, looking at farm animal health and welfare outcomes, specifically trying to look at what George Eustace, the minister at the time, was calling iceberg metrics. So we've sort of been looking, for example, at sheep. We would, is there a particular metric, a particular measure that can give you a really good sense of that system? And with pigs, we felt that there was one metric that you could do that with, and it was, an intact curly tail at point of slaughter gives you an awful lot of information. But with most other breeds, sort of species with sheep or cattle, you need a combination of metrics to get that information across. There isn't a sort of single silver bullet that will tell you whether a farm system is doing well or not. And so I think with sheep, it was something like a low level of anthelmintic use, it was a low level of lameness, and a low worm burden at point of slaughter. So we were sort of looking at that grouping as a way of being able to tell an awful lot about the system, not only in terms of the health and welfare of the animal, but actually probably the farm system, the ecology that it was living within. Have you found a sort of similar thing where, there are key benchmarks, but you can't look at them in isolation, Helen?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we always start with quite broad benchmarking. So I think as an example, it would be the number of empty cows in a suckler herd. If you put 100 cows to the bull, but you've only got 80 in calf. We start with that broad brushstroke, and then we need to drill down into, which groups of animals have particularly suffered. So then you start looking at kind of the empty rate in your first lactation animals. So you do need to make it a cumulative kind of benchmarking experience, and also there'll be some things that people do really well and other things that they don't do as well. So if you're going to engage with farmers, we need to identify the good and the bad in all of their systems, and there will be those good and bad things in everyone's system.
Yeah, interesting. So, Leanne, just sort of coming across to you and Ruminant Revival. Obviously, you're sort of focused on ruminants, on livestock, and there's a sort of sense within your name that you're trying to revive the popularity, the recognition that ruminants have a role in the landscape, a role, as livestock within Britain, where there has been so much bad press that's been taking place over the last few years, particularly towards cattle and methane. But do you see your role as being primarily to support that transition? And then, if that's the case, is that a business model that's really sustainable for a vet?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I've been asked that before. As much as vets traditionally make their money out of time on farm, and a high percentage of that time is sorting out disasters. They're problems that have happened that we get called in at the end stage to sort out, and selling products. Let's not get away from that vets sell antibiotics and vaccines and all that kind of stuff. So I view our role as vets as changing, and I think not only are we making our farmers more sustainable and resilient, we're also making those changes within the vet profession as well. So if you look at some of the data that's come out, there was Zoetis did a study in the summer, and there was a white paper released to industry that suggested that 46.5% of farm vets had considered leaving the profession, and that was through burnout. So if we can turn that around and we can give our vets consultancy roles, advisory roles, if they can have the knowledge and ability to get in there and prevent problems before they happen, we wouldn't have burnout, exhausted vets that run around like headless chickens trying to fight fires. So not only are we going to improve our farmers, make them more resilient and future-proof, do all the good that we can do there. We're going to have farmers that have better mental well-being because they're not doing the disaster management day after day and dealing with all the problems. They'll be in a better headspace, and also you're going to have vets that are happier in their work and that are going to stay in the profession for longer.
But if you're sort of working with farmers across that transition, and at the end of the transition, really you're hoping that they're going to be in a position where they hardly ever need to see the vet. Are you confident that there's enough work for you across the next 20 years?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's a success story. If we can, it's like giving a guy a fishing rod rather than giving him a fish, isn't it? If you can teach him the skills that enables him to problem solve himself and set up that farm in a way that they can problem solve, and every year is not the same. As we know, different climatic conditions will provide different parasite challenges and different nutritional challenges to that farmer. But if you can provide that skill set and that training, and therefore then set that farmer on his way and be there at arm's length in a supportive role, then we've done our job. We don't want to create a system that is completely reliant, because our veterinary skill is also an input to that farm and it's a cost to that farmer. So if we can minimize that and do a good job at having a self-sufficient system, where we still have some knowledge of what's going on and we're some data collection and we oversee that system, then that is a really good place to be.
And thinking about that where obviously, vets traditionally have worked very much, it's with medicines, with the livestock, where what you're talking about within a regenerative approach, within sort of a more holistic approach to livestock, is around the land management as well. Do you find that you're giving land management advice, that you've had to sort of learn more and find out more about land management in order to be able to deliver some of that resilience?
Yeah, massively. So all our vets that work for us, and many vets around the country, have engaged in soil health workshops. They've travelled abroad to see how different farming systems work, and it's really, really common to see vets at farmer walks and things like that now, where they just want to see different systems and how things work for different people and collect new ideas. So I think that has been a massive area of expertise that we as a profession have had to tap into. But I also think business skills as well, that actually ultimately, we're there to deliver a benefit to that farmer, and that farmer has a business to run, and we have to understand fixed costs and variable costs and where we're coming from to help that farmer achieve, pay his mortgage and look after his kids. Ultimately, it's a business, and we need to never forget that.
And that's quite a different thing for a lot of farmers. I'm still surprised the number of farmers that I go to, and they don't have a sort of sense really of their margin, of their profitability, the cost of inputs versus outputs, etc. Do you find again that you're giving business advice around that as you go?
Yeah, to a degree. I think that certainly the farmers I've worked with aren't as open to sharing that information as what I would maybe have liked them to be. And some of the maybe some of the benchmarking groups that Helen's worked with, they've got to that level of trust where they can share that information. So it's all well and good saying that this worked or that worked, but actually putting a financial cost to that or financial benefit to that would really sing home and probably maybe help implement a bit more change, because they'd see that it worked and it cost X and it returned Y. And I think we could be a little bit more open in how we shared some of that information. I think that would benefit a lot of people.
And Helen, that is a good question, isn't it? Around that sort of level of trust in sharing that amount of information, what often feels like quite personal information around finances. How have you been able to establish that level of trust?
It's really important, I think, and having a group that gets to know one another. We haven't achieved it in all of our groups at all, just because of the characters that are involved. So it does tend to be more of a conversation you have individually on farm when the farm is in a safe environment and feels like they won't be under scrutiny if they say something silly. So sometimes it does have to come down to an individual farm conversation rather than being shared within a group.
Yeah, okay, interesting. I know we talked about resilience and resilient farming at various different points, and I've used the word frequently already in the podcast. But Claire, I wonder if you could help us with the definition, because we probably ought to have a sense of what a resilient farm looks like. What is it from your perspective?
Yeah, I suppose the other bit I just want to answer on that question is like resilient vet business as well. So just thinking about what Leanne was saying, like my work is so much more varied now, I think, than it was as a vet in terms of the things that I do and where that money comes from. So in terms of like, I mean, I teach hedge laying now, and that might sound like a random thing from a veterinary perspective, but actually is it? Like, teaching hedge laying on something that's ultimately going to benefit health and welfare on farms for livestock, for me, maybe that's part of it. Maybe, we can be even wider in terms of the sort of things that we offer. So yeah, for my business resilience, me doing lots of different things, whether it's writing or whether it's doing hedge laying, whether it's actually going out and doing vet work, working with individuals, working with groups, it's massively different now. So that's a really nice part to it. And I think farms as well need to potentially have some of that diversity in their business from a resilience perspective. But for me, a resilient farm, I think the main thing to be thinking about at the moment is sort of climate resilience. So I think, and Leanne alluded to it earlier, we're going to see big changes in sort of weather, in sort of seasonality, in parasite patterns. So that includes things like soil compaction, water infiltration, water availability in terms of drought. I think, again, going back to that root cause of problems, if we're going to see cows that have dropped yield because there's a drought problem and there's no grass on that farm, for me, we're far too far down the line of that issue. Whereas we need to be going back to sort of basic soil health principles to pick up on those situations. And landscape design is obviously one of those things which I think is really important. And I've said it before, but I think we're pretty good at designing sheds in the UK, or we think we're good at designing sheds in the UK. But the reality is nobody really thinks about their outdoor environment, what that looks like for a farm. And 90%, even 90% of dairy farms, although we're led to believe otherwise, still use grazing in some capacity. So how are we looking at those environments for the future? Looking at those root causes of problems and profitability. That's like the three-legged stool, isn't it? So there's the environmental, I think, economic or profitability, or, by profitable, I mean, I guess at least economically viable and probably without subsidy. I think that's another thing to consider. And I know, for dairy farmers, even I think it was Anderson's that did that work, but one of the key drivers of profitability is maximizing yield from homegrown forage, getting people who are less reliant on external inputs. And that makes you sort of less reliant on external forces. So whether that is war, whether it's climate change, whether it's energy prices, all of those kind of things as well. And the social aspect, I think we can get carried away. And again, Helen mentioned earlier, is people, what we're looking at on farm, what's driving that farmer and what those motivations are in terms of their own farming context. I think being a happy farmer is probably one thing that gets underestimated. And one of my first questions to farmers on farm now is what are you trying to achieve? What are you aiming to achieve? And I think it's really important that we understand that so we know what we're actually working towards.
Yeah, fantastic. I'm really interested in your hedge laying, and that's sort of almost part of your veterinary business, because it contributes so much to that resilience on farm and that sort of landscape scale approach. And I want to drill into that a little bit more, just to put you on the spot. I'll give you all the difficult questions. So thinking of your three-legged stool, how does the hedge laying sort of help with that?
Everything. So environmentally, so obviously great environmental for in terms of, I should talk about the livestock first, but I'm going to talk about the wildlife. So if we're laying hedges as opposed to cutting them, taking out the bottoms of those very sort of empty bottoms that we often see in hedgerows and those very, very file tops, which don't provide any level of shelter or shade. If we're from a climate resilience perspective, if we're going to see temperatures where we're getting 35 degrees C and over for, potentially weeks in a row, we're going to have areas on the farm where those animals are able to be and be comfortable. And you can get reduced. If your temperature drops by 5 degrees under a hedgerow, for example, the difference for a dairy cow, which might start with heat stress around 22 degrees C, it's relatively low. If you can reduce that temperature by having trees and hedges, if you can improve the shelter that's on the farm for very young animals that maybe struggle to actually regulate their temperature. So you've got the wildlife, so you've got the sort of environmental side, you've got that economic side in terms of reducing issues like heat stress, and then the social side. I mean, hedge laying for me is just a really nice thing to do. It's find it very relaxing. There's not many things in vetting, and I'm sure Helen would agree, where you feel like you've reached an end point. Even if you go and see a sick cow and you treat it, sometimes you might call the farmer back, but they don't answer their phone, and you never actually find out how they're doing. Whereas you've got this finished product and it's done, and getting people into health. And I like the training side of it. It's a different side to training vets on disease, but it's often more engaging in a lot of ways because it's physical and it's practical.
Yeah, brilliant. I mean, Helen, you've got, on your farm, because you're a dairy farmer as well as a vet at Longmoor in Dorset, and you've got so many great big wild hedges as well as ponds and agroforestry going in. Do you get involved in the planting and the sort of management decisions on the farm as well?
Really good at telling my husband what to do, Finley. No, we do, and it is really lovely to do planting, like hedge planting, with a group of other like really motivated individuals. It is a really fun thing to do. Less fun in the middle of winter when the kids are kicking off, but the benefits are massive. And as Claire was saying, like there's such a human element to this, and as soon as you increase the diversity on your farm, like your observations increase and your happiness increases, and there's so much more to think about rather than just like the day-to-day grind of milking and scraping out the slurry and feeding the cows. So I think all these things are so good for like how healthy our minds are and how happy we are on farm.
It's interesting because there's, when we talk about regenerative farms or agroecological farms, I think very often, within this podcast, we're sort of thinking about particular types of farms, often where livestock are outwintered, obviously not always. And, they're often smaller farms, often those regenerative farms are selling into direct sort of cooperative supply chains. And then you've got kind of the other end of farming, which is these fully housed systems, lots and lots of animals within them. But your farm is something really interesting, isn't it? Very much within the middle, where you are very, very much a regenerative farm. You're getting remarkable regenerative outcomes, but you're also a high yielding dairy farm. We've got Holsteins there. And so I guess the question is sort of looking across the board from those smaller agroecological farms working in independent supply chains through to farms like yours that are yielding, lots of nature as well as lots of food to those fully housed systems. Do you think that regenerative veterinary outcomes can be delivered across the board?
I definitely think they can. It is quite a long journey, and you have to be prepared to make some mistakes and act on the back of those along the way. But it is really, really rewarding to do. I think the challenge we have is making sure that we identify things that people are already doing within their system in order to engage them. So like hedge laying is a really nice example. Like all farmers can talk about hedges and how often they cut their hedges. Do they make an A-frame? Do they absolutely obliterate it to the same level each year? Like you can have all these conversations on farm. So we need to connect with the farmers and work out what motivates them. It may be something like compost, which is a random topic that I now like talk about, which I never thought I'd talk about as a vet. But there are lots of farmers who love like composting their FYM really effectively. So it's just working out like what little things we can engage on each farm, which then eventually builds into the bigger picture thinking.
And I guess, within all farms, we're talking about water, and water, if there's too much water there, then that can be sort of holding and carrying disease, parasites, that sort of thing. And so it's about making sure that the management of that land is functioning. And if the animals are out there, that there's enough grass for them, that soil is covered as much of the year as possible. I mean, those are all things that you'd have thought if farmers have got livestock outside, those are all things that all farmers ought to be interested in to one extent or another.
Yeah, and I think they are. Sometimes they just need the time to stop and think about it because they have really, really busy days. As dairy farms, their phones are going off all the time. They're being asked lots of questions by their team. So sometimes they just need the opportunity to stop and think about what they're doing. And we can all facilitate that. And I think it does just come back to engaging in what drives them and then working on developing that and creating that really strong ecosystem within the farm. And I think as a vet, we need to recognise that there are lots of people feeding into that team. They'll have lots of different advice from different people. So, we need to work out who we can point them in the direction of. Like, say, can I recommend them that they go and see Claire laying hedges or talk to Leanne? We need to be open to involving more people and broadening the discussions to help those farms.
Yeah, it's really
I was
interesting.
laughing. Sorry, Philo. I was laughing yesterday. So I rang Helen, and I'm obviously a new entrant farmer this year. And I said to Helen, I used to think I was the most important part of a farmer's day. Like, if I went to not like I was bigging myself up, but I was like, if I'm going to see the routine, I'm the most important part. And I think farming has made me realize what a tiny, tiny part or a tiny bit of influence you can actually have on a day-to-day basis. Because there's so much more going on. So yeah.
But as Helen was sort of indicating there is a role, isn't there, from these sort of outside practitioners like vets that come on farm in finding ways to facilitate those conversations. So, as from your past, so many farm walks where you're looking at earthworms and, doing worm counts and that sort of thing. And if vets are sort of involved in going to lots of farms in a particular area and they start to hear that there are questions that the majority of farmers are starting to ask, then there's a role that, vets can play in bringing farmers together to have that discussion on a farm that's really succeeding with that particular outcome.
Yeah, I think, and what both Helen and Leanne have alluded to is the trust part of it, and I think vets have that role. I mean, we are in a lot of ways bound by confidentiality. That is so people often, I think, feel they can have some of those conversations with us, whether it's about some things that they're interested in. Often I've found it's been previously about things like mental health as well. You're a trusted person, you're probably not going to tell anyone, but we do, and I think as vets we've got better at that, is having the ability to signpost people to the help that they need, regardless of what situation that they're in, because of that relationship that you have with people, which is really valuable.
Yeah, and a lot of those things that we've been talking about today, whether it's reducing medications or thinking about managing the land differently, managing your business differently, that can save farmers a lot of money. And so in terms of sort of thinking about this change in livestock management, Leanne, why would you think more farmers aren't working like this? There's the chance to save money and have better herd health. Why isn't everyone doing it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think a little bit of uncertainty and a fear of change, a little bit of apprehension. And I think from conversations I've had with farmers about exactly that, when you almost get to the point of frustration of, well, this is what we're doing and this is what we could do, this is all the positive things that could come out of it. Some of it's peer pressure that, that they, getting back to Helen's analogy of looking over the hedge, they get criticised why they've got 3 foot high pastures and why their cows are only in there for a day at a time and why is all those electric fences out there, and there's a certain amount of that, and I think you also get that interesting dynamic on farms which can be very beneficial but also can be quite difficult to manage between succession between generations. So you've maybe got potentially older generation that wants to change and there's reluctance from the younger generation, or quite often the other way around. So I think there's lots of reasons which maybe hold back the changes that need to happen. In my experience, there usually has to be a disaster on farm to actually make that change, which is really sad. And sometimes that is, for example, triple resistance to anthelmintics in sheep. So they almost get to the stage where they're like, well, I can't keep sheep anymore because I can't manage my worm burdens. And we know there's other ways around that, but that makes them make that change. Or very, very difficult calving during the spring where there's a lot of veterinary interventions, a lot of cesareans, a lot of carnage, mortality, that often induces change. Or just that the bank manager turns around and says, right, no, stop, you've gone too far. So I suppose our role as vets is to get in there and maybe try and facilitate that change and support them through that change before we get to the disasters, because that really is when there's nowhere else to go. And I think we alluded to it before, during some of those change processes, we need to learn, and we do make mistakes and mistakes happen, and that's how we learn. But there needs to be a buffer financially to allow those mistakes to happen. And certainly in England, we've had that BPS payment coming in, and that's now effectively gone. So the profit margins are certainly on our suckler and sheep farms have absolutely plummeted, and those guys are now wanting to change, and they're almost up against it because it's almost a little bit too late. They haven't got that safety margin that they had before. So again, the pressure's on, and it's getting harder and harder.
Thanks, Leah. There is a degree to which, this is a conversation that we've been having, within the regenerative movement over the last few years, that very often people come to regenerative agriculture because there's been a crisis. And so how can we help people get there without that crisis? That's what you were just sort of alluding to. And I guess when it comes to sort of regenerative farming more broadly, looking at those sort of farm system changes, it's about trying to find ways of not having to do that full transition, but making sort of tweaking changes, small changes on the road to that sort of broader transition. Are there things that you think people can think about within their herd health plans, within their sort of approach to livestock, which is more incremental? Are there sort of easy things that all farmers can do without having to change everything?
Yeah, and I think that what I was alluding to at the beginning is when we, is a farmer regenerative or not, some of these little changes, does that class him as a regenerative farmer? But he is applying some principles to improve soil health. I think our golden wish as vets really is to get livestock into some kind of rotation. So it's a lot to ask a farmer to go from a set stock system onto 12-hourly or 24-hourly moves. That's a huge step to make. But even if we can get them into, thinking about moving their livestock every fortnight, and then reduce that to every week, and then every 4 days, and then if we can just try and get that mindset, and then they will see that their grass grows, and they will see that their lambs do better, and that they need less parasite treatments, and they have less lameness, and their yows are in better body condition score pre-tupping, and all of a sudden then things start to change, and you get positive outcomes, and that kind of fuels the fire. So I think any kind of rotation on farm is great. And also from a parasite point of view, just, grazing those pastures a wee bit longer, not nailing them back down to how sometimes they get in a set stock system. And we saw that this summer when, the ground was burning up. We'd killed all biology within the soil. We had dung and fecal pats everywhere because there was no biological activity to get rid of that fecal material. And it all just compounded. And getting back to Claire's point before, where it's almost too late when you get to a system and the farmer's got no grass and there's nowhere to go. Sometimes that is not where the farmer's going to be receptive to your advice. So all of a sudden you turn around and say, oh, well, we need to improve soil health to improve drought resistance, and we need to have more diversity in our swards, and plantain is drought resistant and all this kind of stuff. He's gone past that point. He can't handle that at that time to be given all that information. He's at crisis. So I suppose that comes back again to education and knowledge transfer to make sure folk that know there's another way, and building those resilient systems before we get to that crisis point.
Yeah. Okay.
I think, sorry, Philip, integrating parasite management plans is a really nice for farmers. So, loads of them struggle with young stock management and are relying on traditional wormers and relatively intensive worming methods. But that's a really nice in terms of discussing wider regen ideas and principles, because there's clearly a direct financial advantage to them engaging with us on these conversations. And actually, it's really interesting. It's really stimulating for farmers to think in a slightly different way about how they rotate their animals and which animals they use to make pasture cleaner and how long they leave the sward. And we've got really intelligent people that we're working with, and you can see them you can see their minds being like, oh yeah, that's cool, we can do this and that. And it's really nice way of starting to engage them.
And of course, having a trusted professional like a vet who's sort of asking those questions within that sort of confidentiality approach that Claire was mentioning as well, I guess that's really important. And as you say, to sort of inspire those conversations. Now, over the next few months, partly because of sponsorship, which is going to be coming in from Friars Moor Livestock Health, which we're really grateful for, Helen. So thank you for that. We're going to be dipping more deeply into a range of veterinary topics. But today, I really just want to scratch the surface. And I wonder if we could talk through a few of the areas in which a more regenerative veterinary approach can help. And, we mentioned there things like parasite management. So perhaps, Leanne, we could start with sheep and liver fluke. How can land management, how can different sort of farm management reduce or eliminate the need for anthelmintics?
Yeah, great topic, and very timely, I would say, at this time of year as well. So the big benefit we have for fluke is that we can test very accurately for it. So we've got blood tests that'll pick up infection a couple of weeks after an animal ingests the immature stages, and we've got fecal testing. So we can actually get a good idea on farm where the high risk areas are. So as we know, the fluke parasite requires a mud seal as its intermediate host. So no snail, no parasite. So if we can work out where those mud seal populations are and avoid them through strategic grazing at high risk times of year, we're not going to pick up that fluke infection. So that takes a little bit of work. And again, it may vary year on year a little bit, but we can use some of the testing to map the farm, avoid those parasite areas at high risk times of year, which is great. And again, when we come back to almost conventional veterinary medicine, as much as with the good tests that we've got, you can test and then treat. So we know when we need to treat, and rather than just having to blanket, so we can preserve those pharmaceuticals for greater use. If you want to be all holistic about it, then ducks eat the mud snail. So we could integrate ducks into our stacking enterprise and our regenerative farm if we wanted to go that way. I've been asked many times before whether geese do the same thing, but unfortunately not. Geese are grazers. They're not mud snail eaters, unfortunately. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't have fluke on many farms on the west of the British Isles. So yeah, that's an example how through grazing management, avoidance, and mapping your farm and knowing your farm, we can reduce unnecessary fluke treatments.
Yeah, I was thinking about the ducks, even just as you mentioned them, and the way in which actually, if you're fencing off some of those areas that are wet and they're going to remain wet, then you can sort of develop ponds and actually start attracting wildfowl and so on to there. So you're building up those populations of things that make a meal out of the problem that you've got on the farm. So really interesting. Thanks for that. Now, Claire, flies are another issue, of course, both for cows and sheep. So how can farmers deal with these through change management?
It's interesting with flies, isn't it? So like Leanne said, the great thing about things like fluke or like worms is you can test for them, but often it's flies are there and they're either causing disease or they're not. So I think that's a first really important question to answer. Are the flies causing disease? Are they causing significant levels of fly worry where you are getting production losses, New Forest eye, mastitis, etc.? If they're not, it's a question of whether or not how much of a problem are they? Our cows have really long eyelashes. They have really long tails for flicking flies off, those kind of things as well. And I think one of the things as well, whether you're talking about any kind of parasite, is probably thinking about resistance. And it's like going back to what Helen said, is getting farmers engaged in that from a financial perspective. Anthelmintic and sort of synthetic pyrethravoid resistance and all those kind of things are a real concern. And particularly in areas like South Africa, for example, where they, if you get bitten by a tsetse fly and you get a problem with it, like I forget what it's called now, trypanosomiasis or something, which is spread by the fly, that's going to cause potentially disease and more often death in livestock. So obviously a lot of products are used there, and there's more and more evidence coming out, particularly from those sort of areas where there is resistance to fly products. So thinking about that and trying to remember to use them only when necessary if they're causing a problem. Thinking about diversity as well. So the thing with these products is what we know is they kill everything. So they kill the good stuff and they kill the bad stuff, and they come out pretty much unchanged in their feces as well. So there is lots of evidence that show that biodiversity breeds resilience in terms of if there's more things there's less things that are likely to cause a problem from a pest control perspective. So I think that's another thing to think about. Trees are an interesting one that come up, and there's now differing views. So I used to be of the belief that more trees would just always be a good thing. Some evidence shows that there's more flies under certain trees, but again, if you have one tree in a field for me and you have 100 cows under that tree, that is very different to having 10 or 20 trees in that field, or more places they can go. Because if you have just that one tree, yes, it will be good, but you'll get that build up of sort of fecal contamination under there, more flies. So again, going back to what Leanne's saying, having some rotation, keeping your animals moving, keeping them away from those pats, thinking about what their landscape looks like. I mean, and going back to nature again, I always think swallows always tend to arrive when the flies do. A single, there's even more recent work showing that a swallow pair will eat 6,000 flies a day. Now, if we're not encouraging those animals and things onto our farms by what our landscape looks like, by providing nest boxes, all of those kind of things, I think we're going to potentially lose out. And there's anecdotal evidence on a lot of things. So walnut trees would be one, that they reduce fly burden. So they used to be put around parklands, around benches and things like that. And then they were actually used in people. So people used to use juglone, which is from walnut, to reduce sort of lice and mites. I mean, the thought of having lice and mites myself makes me a bit cringy. But then alternatives are a tricky one, and they're a tricky one for vets. I think both Leanne and Helen would agree. So there are things like neem oil. eucalyptus oil. So neem oil does actually reduce sort of tick burdens, for example. So any of these sort of ectoparasites or the parasites on the outside of their body. But we're very limited in terms of how we can advise their use of them as vets, because unless they're licensed for preventative or they're licensed for treatment, it's really hard for us to actually advise using those in livestock. Now, you could argue we're not necessarily prescribing them, so it's a slightly different topic. But we don't have a lot of the research behind it in terms of those products. So there's a lot of research that says things like it highlights the potential of this as a treatment, so like chrysanthemum, for example. But there's not a really evidence behind it or any of the decision making there, or not enough research, I would say, about it as well. And things like knowing there's a vaccine available for New Forest eye. So lots of people who've had a New Forest eye problems this year, there hasn't historically been a vaccine. Now it has to be imported and it's under SPC, but there are definitely preventative ways you can go about it. Now, I'm not saying, again, like, you can't ever use a fly treatment, because if you're having issues, like Leanne said, when you're in crisis mode, you have to treat that problem, and that problem is probably going to be a pharmaceutical based product. So it's finding the times when you can talk about those things easier. And working with your system. But yeah, I think for me, there's lots of things we can think about that aren't just based around instead of just putting the fly treatment on, it's like, okay, what are we going to do about it next year? So, your fly treatment's gone on now. Let's have a think about it for the future.
Yeah, when you were talking about the trees, it reminded me that certainly when I was younger, if I would go on a walk on a hot day, you end up with loads of flies buzzing around you, especially when you got a bit sweaty. But I always find that if I could find an oak tree and just rub my head in that, the flies were much more interested in the oak tree than they were in me, and so they'd stay there, which was good. Is there something about sort of herd management as well in sort of mob grazing systems where you're moving the cattle on enough, sort of quickly enough, that the eggs in the dung just don't have time to hatch and the cattle have moved on, and you can sort of manage fly burden in that way?
I think if you're moving them daily and you've got big herds potentially, I mean, flies don't actually go that far away from their feces, but I suppose the point that they're not just on top of dirty pastures all the time is probably a good thing. Now, in the summer, the fly, the time it takes from a fly to go into a pat and come out is days, whereas in the winter months, it might be weeks. Yeah. So the hotter it gets, potentially, the more difficult that is. But moving animals, just keeping them away from their feces, not only from a fly perspective, but also from a worm perspective as well, is also a really good way of thinking about it. And those longer rest periods, leaving that longer grass structure there, most of your worm eggs are found in the very low, in the bottom of that sward, like Leanne said. So all of those things can contribute towards it as well. And I think, I think unless flies are a particular issue and they're causing a problem, our livestock are pretty well designed to cope with it, or certain breeds and genetics and things like that as well will also play a role in that too.
Lovely, thank you. Helen, thinking about seasonally grazed dairy systems like your own, especially with higher yielding Holsteins where, they're sort of big udders, how does management affect issues like lameness and mastitis?
So ultimately, we need our cows to be able to walk to our grazing paddocks, and we need them to produce clean milk. So it comes back to that three-legged stool that Claire was talking about. But with slightly different legs, I suppose. So we need to think about genetics. That's incredibly important in terms of management, so we can build real resilience into our herds through our genetic choices, particularly with cell count and mastitis and lameness. So that's one feature. We need to think about the environment that the animals are lying in. So ultimately, we need our animals to lie down and ruminate and produce milk. So whether they're housed or grazed, that environment needs to be clean. And that returns to that conversation about mob grazing and moving our animals on and leaving higher sward length. Nutrition is obviously really important. And the team that you have and how you manage your team, which again sounds not very veterinary related, but motivating your team to create a really good environment for your animals, whether they're housed or grazed, is incredibly important. Making sure that they're consistent in their milking parlour routine to prevent the spread of infection, motivating them to create routine trimming protocols to ensure that our feet on our cows are in as good shape as possible. Like, all those things are really important, but they rely on a team approach to make them work.
And there's lots of data coming from the ear tags now as well.
Yeah, there is. And there's so much data available on farms, and it's becoming much, much more widespread. So quite often now I'm just pinged a picture of a cow's rumination activity, and we can tell loads from that. And that data is actually really important because, say, for example, if you use lameness, we do a lot of mobility scoring on farm, which is a snapshot of how those cows are walking on the day. And we can obviously look at the trends of those, but they're relatively subjective. So although there's a standardized training course for those mobility trainers, those mobility scorers, we're all still human, so there's going to be a level of subjectivity. But obviously now we can use cameras to monitor cows walking out the parlour, and we can look at their body conditions through that, and all those things make the data much more accurate, and then the advice that we can give them is much more useful.
Now, Helen talked about genetics there as sort of one part of that three-legged stool, Leanne, but I wanted to touch on genetics just a little bit more and think about how active breeding and presumably an active culling program can improve health and welfare outcomes.
Yeah, I think there's more of a move to making sure that the livestock are adapted to your farm rather than adapting your farm to the livestock. So we could take, for example, an upland suckler farm as an example. So for this year, straw is an absolute fortune. These guys don't have any arable; they're buying all their straw in. So we're looking at potentially changing genetics to allow the cow size to be reduced, so that we can actually outwinter for longer. So every day or every week that those cows can be outwintered and don't have to be housed is a massive financial gain for those farmers. So that's an example where we're changing the genetics of the animals over time to make that farm more resilient and sustainable into the future, because you can't stomach a £50,000 straw bill every year. And I think there can be more subtle than that. It doesn't have to be a massive dramatic change. I think the beauty of being able to breed your own animals and have homebred replacements and select animals that are suited to your system is a huge benefit. And the epigenetics comes into it. Everybody talks about epigenetics, which very simply is the ability of an animal to express genes based on its environment that it's within. So if your environment suits that animal's genetic makeup, then it will thrive in your environment. And it can be a whole range of things. It can be how they their grazing patterns. So for example, if you're mob grazing, do they go into how to get their head down and get their feed, or do they wander around, look at the scenery and everybody else is eating their grass? Do they break through the electric fence? How do they select the pasture they're on? So do they always choose the really proteinaceous herbage, and therefore they scour and they get dirty perineums, then they're attracted to flies? We don't want those animals in the system. So when we talk about data, some of this data collection can be really basic. It's just observations for characteristics that you don't really want in your herd and flock, and therefore when you're making your breeding decisions, we can select animals that we want to keep heifer replacements out of, or young lamb replacements out of, to get that genetic gain over a long period of time. And it depends on the heritability of those traits how quick we get that genetic gain, but there's certainly massive advancements that can be made without massive investment or a lot of data collection in terms of technology, just using your eyes and be able to record that information and interpret it.
Yeah, really interesting. Claire, we're coming towards the end of the programme, and I just wonder if you could sort of help us to start summing up. And what do you think are the most important starting points for farmers wanting to reduce their vet bills and their use of medications?
I think, as Helen said earlier, I think that parasite control is still it's still really low hanging fruit for a lot of farms. So I think often the reason is it doesn't involve your vet. So it's really easy to go into a country store and just pick up a wormer or a product or whatever without having that conversation. So I think if you can just sit down with them and have a conversation, you can move away. We've moved away very much so from blanket treatment of antibiotics in livestock, but I think sometimes with sort of parasite control that still happens. So if we can move away from that by using things like fecal egg counts, by just starting to look and observe a bit about what's going on within your herd or your flock, that's a really good way of starting it. And I think just having a conversation with your vet. So what percentage, thinking about things like what percentage of your vet spend is on sort of preventative versus treatments. If both two farms have exactly the same vet spend and one is 90% on treatments and 10% on preventatives and the other way around for another farm, you can potentially almost kind of get an idea about who's going to be the most profitable or who's going to have the better outcome within those farming systems. So I think looking at what those spends are, and one of the things I'll hear from the more regenerative side is our vets don't understand what we're trying to do. They don't get it. And I would say, have a conversation with them, build that relationship with your vet and say, this is what we're trying to achieve. Show them, tell them what you're doing, ask them how you can plan ahead for some of those things or you don't want to do. So if you say you want to be using less antibiotics, I guarantee your vet will be really interested in that conversation. And I think it's that thing about working with, like ask them a question. You know, the thing, a lot of the work that I've done, obviously from like dung beetle talks, etc., has come off like parasite control, and that's meant I've ended up with working with all different kinds of farms, from very, very what I would call conventional farms right through the spectrum to regenerative farms. So, and in terms of things like, people might see a dung beetle and think that's something I want to know more about, and then you'll go out to a farm that you realize that they're using a hell of a lot of product that they probably don't really need, and getting them to engage on something, that's like such a win-win to be able to do something like that on a farm where inputs might be quite a big cost in that system, and you can make a significant difference just by changing that one little thing.
Fantastic. I've just realised that I made a massive faux pas earlier in the programme when I was talking about you doing lots of sort of worm conversations. And of course it wasn't, it was dung beetles. I'm getting my arthropods mixed up. Yeah, fantastic. So Helen, I appreciate there's a degree of repetition here, but thinking about those farmers in more mainstream systems particularly, perhaps who are pretty inherently sceptical of regen or agroecology and these sort of faddy type things as they see it, what should their livestock health priorities be?
So I think probably the most important topic that we are talking to our farmers about at the moment is just making sure that they're resilient to climate change and heat stress, and that feeds into lots of different things. So in terms of livestock health priorities, that means that we can tick off those low-hanging fruit that Claire mentioned, like parasite control, heifer rearing, how we make the most of the genetics that they've invested in. Like, those are really simple priorities which will ultimately help them in improving their farm resilience. So I think we need to focus on those low-hanging fruit if they are skeptical of regen, and also identify what they're already doing, which they may not necessarily relate directly to regen principles.
And Leanne, just finally, resilience, as we've said, is key for ecological and food security. Do you get a sense that a change is taking place across the veterinary industry more broadly, or are the approaches that we've been talking about today, sort of bearing in mind the fact that you three are, of course, sort of leaders within your profession in this way, are they still a bit out there and avant-garde so far as most farmers and vets are concerned?
I think there's a huge following of vets, very similar to ourselves, that are working away, talking to their farmers right now as we sit here, doing a great deal of work to change systems. And I think we've got to remember that our priority as vets is animal health and welfare. It's not selling product, it's not making money. We signed an oath, and that's why we all became vets. So I think there's a lot to be done, and I think the vet schools are catching on. There's now sustainability modules in some of the veterinary degrees, and I think older members of the profession, I was going to say, which includes myself, Claire and Helen, have a responsibility to coach those younger vets, and not for them to fear the word regenerative and the regenerative farms and long grass grazing. They need to embrace that. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is integrated parasite management and antibiotic reduction, and all the things that we talk about ultimately do help soil health as well. So I would embrace any young vet that wants to be a bit more in this field to listen to some of the podcasts that are available and get on YouTube, speak to other vets, engage in CPD. But I think there has been a big change over the last 10 years, possibly, and there's the sky's the limit.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks so much, Leanne. That's been so interesting, and that is sadly all we have time for. I'd like to thank my guests, Helen Rogers, Leanne Oliver and Claire Whittle. If you've enjoyed listening, please come back and listen to more. Tell your friends, like us, review us and share our links. Farmgate is the world's highest ranking food security podcast, and Farmgate leaders, Martin's Farm and Wheat from the Chaff, are all available on the Farmgate channel if you just scroll back in your podcast feed. Farmgate is part of 8.9.com, the land use news channel, which is supported by First Milk, Pelican Ag, Rural Solutions, the nature-friendly farming network, Friars Moor Livestock Health, Agrolo and individual donors. I've been ffinlo Costain. Bye for now.